Right, where was I? So I'm just going to introduce the Wild Trout Trust. So we are a national conservation organisation. We have a membership base of around 2,000 people. We really are trying to operate at the grassroots. We believe that if you get the habitat right, they will come. And they, in this instance, is the wild brown trout. If it's good enough for trout, it'd be good enough for chub, it'd be good enough for dace, it'd be good enough for kingfishers, herons, the whole ecosystem. Trout need diverse habitats, they need good water quality, they need good flow. So that's why we use them. But it's not just about trout. It can be about grayling that live in clean, swift-flowing streams as well. It can be about mayfly that live for up to 2 years or more in the silts and emerge. It can also then be gone along the predators, the top fish-eating birds, the herons, the egrets, the kingfishers. So we are quite diverse, and we operate to try and work with communities, but we also disseminate information. So we are involved a little bit in the beaver debates, trying to make sure that is steered in the right direction. We undertake walkover assessments for community groups, for fishing clubs, for conservation organisations. We enter into partnership projects. We are supported on one element of the work we do by the Environment Agency. That's our advisory visit service. And that is how I got to be involved at the Babram Research Campus through the advisory visit programme. These are the kind of reports. It's not, can I ask you to try focusing it? That will become much sharper, yeah. Please. It was the top dial.
You shout when it looks right.
Bad, better. It's not 100% sharp.
See the pixels, basically. That's, you won't improve.
Other way, please.
Keep you moving.
That's better. That's the best it's going to be.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we undertake visits to sites. We'll walk and talk along the riverbank with the landowner, the fishing club, or the conservation group. Then we'll provide them a detailed report pointing out the goods and the bads. Those reports may then ultimately become a project proposal. So here I'm using an example where I undertook an advisory visit service for the Pansanger anglers down in the Pansanger Park on the River Mimram. They were very interested in the work, the ideas that I had put into them. Then I worked up a costed plan for them, and that was actually implemented, part of it, last year. So we go from that initial visit, maybe a walkover, like I've undertaken here on the River Gwash, coming through to a project proposal. But what actually is a chalk stream or chalk river? There's a lot of interest in them. Many people saying they must be restored, but their main features is the crystal clear water, that stable flow, that constant flow that should start to pick up in the winter months and should start to discharge or decline really into June and July, with the lowest flow year period being before the autumn recharge through September and October. But our chalk streams should always have plentiful water in them. And that's the problem we've now got into the Cambridge area. And those chalk streams are also dissolving lots of minerals, which then means you can have a whole range of plant diversity because you've got good water, light penetration through that water, which is driving the high plant diversity in the ecosystem. You've got soft, damp margins. So there's a lot of range of ecological niches for plants to find literally their right foothold. You might have trailing branches coming down to a more wild chalk stream, which gives lots of marginal cover, lots of that interface between the land and the water environment. But as I've said, they're almost all man-made. What do I mean by man-made? I mean they've been channeled from the Romans years ago to provide energy, to drive mills. Many of our chalk streams are not actually in a natural or pristine state, but they are highly regarded and they are highly important for our riverine ecosystems, which is why many of them in the south of England actually have conservation designations attached to them. But it's a bit of a quirky question when someone says, let's restore them, because here in South Cambridgeshire, many of our small streams have actually been turned into drainage ditches to drain this wetland that we were all sitting on. Well, our forefathers were trying to actually drain the land before the Enclosure Act. So if we were to restore them, where are we really going back to in time? And that's quite an important question to us to ask. But where are the chalk streams in England? It's that chalk belt running from the edge of Dorset, coming up through our part of Hertfordshire and Cambridgeshire to North Norfolk, and then swinging back over the Wash up into North Yorkshire and Hull. So you have the most northern chalk streams up there. Where are they in the Cambridgeshire area? It's really the whole of the River Cam system. If I can get my eyes focused properly. This is the Upper Cam, Newport Way here. This is, I call it the Wendon Zambo stream, flowing through the Shelfords. The River Granta is coming down here, and the River Ree is rising at Ashwell Springs and coming down to meet the Cam, flowing on through Cambridge. What do those colours mean? Not an awful lot now, I'll say, because this is a map from 2019, and now, sadly, under the Water Framework Directive, a national classification of our streams, we don't have any watercourses that are considered to be good. That's because there's another chemical parameter brought in, and all of the UK's rivers failed on its chemical parameters. But the important point about this slide, which is from 2019, is that it showed the Wendon Zambo stream as being rated for good. That's the Hoffer Brook, and that's the River Shep. All of those three watercourses have in common that they do not have sewage treatment works on them. So they were not receiving what we now know to be an awful scandal is sewage going into our rivers at high frequency. I wasn't even aware of that before the news got out. But before, we had these three streams that were still considered to be good water quality. And that's incredibly important that we don't allow more sewage discharges into our rivers. We're never going to get them into better quality if we keep putting our waste into them. And it's shameful. But what makes our chalk stream special? This should be a lovely picture of Water Crowfoot. It's just about showing through there. Our chalk streams have this typical English appearance on a landscape. When you see a chalk stream in the height of June, it's a thing of beauty. There's lush waterside meadows. There might be great plant diversity. You might have a completely white covering of flowers across the top of it. Or you might have cushions of this plant, starwort there, deflecting the flow, making faster pathways. And you might have the brown trout like this hiding behind it, just off the flow, ready to nip out and grab its food. You might have lesser water parsnip growing in the slightly silty areas, or you might have water mints and brook limes at the margins. It's this high plant diversity, which is attributed to the good light penetration into the water, readily available nutrients, and none of this horrendous floods that come down the river in winter and rip out plants and wash them downstream. So you've got good, stable environments for good opportunities for different species to find the right niche. And in amongst that lush plants, you may be lucky enough to find the UK's fastest declining mammal, the water vole. But here in the Cam catchment, that little species is increasing, which is fantastic news. And it's really down to the control of the mink by people at the Countryside Restoration Trust and the Wildlife Trust, who've taken it upon themselves to get rid of their non-native predator. Those little animals can be quite adaptable if we give them the good habitat, that lush water, lush vegetation, and keep away the non-native predator. But you might also find more unusual things like that in our chalk streams. That's a dendritic form of freshwater sponge. Freshwater sponge is relatively common under stones, but you don't often see them taking on this hand-like appearance growing at the bottom of riverbeds. That one I used to find that in part of the River Shep, just in front of the railway bridge. I have also seen that, Peter, growing in the small brick arch at Hawkston before lots of the things were stirred up there and before we lost the water clarity, which we appear to have gone backwards now. But keep a lookout for things like this, freshwater sponge. And our chalk streams have been an inspiration for our writers, Constable painting countryside scenes. Our mills have given us the power to process materials, to grind foods, to enable us to advance. We've harnessed the energy from that stable flow to drive mills. We've diverted rivers across the landscape to follow contour lines so that they can then drop down through this engine that a mill is and drop out the bottom and flow off. So we have actually rechanneled our rivers to fit into the landscape to drive our machines for our benefit. So many of our rivers, like the River Granta, in some places are not even at the bottom of the valley anymore, which means that when you lose this water, when it drops in the aquifer, you don't have the water to support the river which is in the wrong place on the aquifer, on the valley. If it is in the bottom, it would be naturally more resilient to that water dropping. If you try and hold a river on the side of a valley, when that valley starts to dry out, that river channel is going to start to dry out. And that's also the problem. We've got some of our rivers around here in the wrong place. And then this little animal that spends 2 to 3 years in the silt and emerges really at the end of May, that is the mayfly, and through June. You can see phenomenal hatches of that invertebrate now along the Shepworth Riverside Meadows in the first week or 2 of June. And that's something I never saw as a younger boy. And I put that down to the fact that our rivers are not being dredged like they used to now. So enabling stable, clean, silty environments to establish and have that duration of time so that these invertebrates can fly out, they can mate, they can lay their eggs, and those eggs can undertake that complete life cycle to emerge again. I used to see a few mayflies when I was younger, but nothing on the scale we see now. And that, I would say, is a good indicator. But this is quite a sad scene. So this is the compensation flow at Falmere watercress beds, site of special scientific interest. Here, you should see water upwelling naturally, but due to over-abstraction to supply us, to supply our needs, to supply our growing population, more water is lawfully being taken from the environments. We've lowered that water table, and it means that some springs simply do not flow anymore. So I will say, thank goodness, there has been a pipe network set up after the drought of 76, established in the early 1980s, first used to my knowledge in 1990 when we had the first droughts, when the Bourne Brook dried up, when the River Shep started to dry up. It's not a sustainable way of managing our rivers, but if our rivers weren't supported, we would have lost them about 30 years ago. We wouldn't be standing here talking about Cambridgeshire chalk streams because they would have been gone. They would have been another thing forgotten about our generation, talked about by our grandparents. We've got to find a better way of managing our water resources because with climate change, it's only going to get tougher. We're going to have less leeway for margin, and we might find that we end up in these drought situations more frequently. So we've got to have better water management, and that's got to involve finding better sustainable sources, and that's really capturing the water that we try and flush downhill. We've got to build reservoirs. We've got to be smarter how we use that limited resource. We have many pressures. We have outfalls, built ugly things into our small little streams. Who knows what comes out of them? We talk about sustainable urban drainage systems, but often it's just put it in a pipe, leave it in a pipe, and when it first rains, it'll flush out. That first flush is horrible. That first flush is relatively deoxygenated water. It's sat underground, and when we have that summer storm, it flows out of these manholes, these headwall covers, and goes into these small streams. We also have, this is a part of the River Grant at Hildesheim that was kept flowing more or less by effluent, some Linton sewage treatment works. That's why it looks a bit brown. But thank goodness it didn't cause a fish kill. But weird that we've got our streams flowing almost supported by effluent. Would it work better if the lights went off in the room? We also have issues with lack of scouring flows. That seems better, stronger colour to me. We have siltation of the riverbed. We need scouring high flows in the wintertime to flush out that organic matter. If we don't get winter floods, we don't get that sediment transport down our rivers. If we have areas where nobody has undertaken any management, we get our streams engulfed in tunnels of scrub and trees and brambles. It might be okay if that river had the power to push its way around, or if those trees fell in and caused that river to naturally move within its channel. But here you can see large woody material has been collected, put to the side, but yet this tunnel has been kept. There's virtually no natural plants growing in that shaded environment. Plants are so important for our chalk rivers. And then, of course, we've got invasive species. Himalayan balsam, taller than me, up at the River Cam, up at Audley End. We've got the signal crayfish undermining our banks, kicking out lots of silt, scurrying around in our rivers and actually disturbing the silt and causing them to become more turbid. So they can then start to actually affect their water clarity, which will mean less plants growing because you've got less light penetrating into the water, as well as an upset in all manner of invertebrates feeding on small fish that would naturally live under the stones. All in all, they're a bit of a menace, but we hope that we may find some balance. We also have algae growing in our chalk streams. This is actually a ponded environment on the River Granta at Linton. It's ponded because it's held behind small weirs. People seem to want to hold water back with weirs, to hold water back. Well, it looks deeper, doesn't it? But if you hold water back, that water slows up, it becomes more exposed to sunlight, so you get it becoming a pond environment, and it literally warms up and it grows slow flow algae communities. That's not how a chalk stream should look. It'd be shallow and swift and gravelly. Another problem we've had in the River Cam catchment is the overuse of herbicide to control some of the excessive vegetation that's again a consequence of too much phosphates in our water, low flows, lack of scour. There's been herbicide used, and I'd say it's been used too widely. I say herbicide is a tool to be used wisely, but not widely. So what's at risk? It's these things that can't jump, they can't swim fast, and all in all, they find it hard to colonise new environments. You've got our native crayfish there. That was in the River Cam, I think to about 10 years ago at Ickleton. There was still a population in the Cam. That's why I found that one when I was called to identify it. Brook lamprey, an ancient fish, more closely related to sharks. They don't have spine, they don't have bones in, they have cartilage. You have stone loach, spined loach, and bullhead. These are all small fish, hugely important prey for otters. They live under stones, as their names would suggest, but they don't jump, they don't swim up rapids. They might try and crawl, but when we lose headwater streams, these are some of the species that are disappearing, and this is the one that was lost from the 9 wells after the drought of 76. That had lived there, that flatworm, Crinoba alpina. It's also meant to be in the springs at Ashwell Springs. That was there since the last ice age. So it's going to take an awful long time and a whole landscape change before some of these species get redistributed. That's our natural history. That's what was special about some of these streams. But we've lost some of those in the last 30 years. And it's a crying shame. Then, as our rivers get smaller and smaller, you have less spawning habitat. Spawning habitat here, clean gravels, or what brown trout need to spawn upon. If those clean gravels are only such a small patch where the river's flowing just around here, how is the fish going to use the flow to move over that gravel? That pair of fish here couldn't even sit in that flow there. And if they were successful, then the next pair of fish that come along are also desperate to find a spawning habitat. So you run the risk of other fish spawning over. And they actually physically move that gravel to form a redd, which is effectively a nest in which those eggs are taken care of. They incubate, they hatch, and the fry live inside that gravel for something in the order of 100 days before they start to hatch out into March. So they're very vulnerable. And that's why we need these stable river habitats at times in our headwater streams if these fish species to make it through. I'll also add that chub need clean gravel, dace need clean gravel, bullhead need clean stones. We need sediment control, we need clean water on our rivers, and we need gravel areas. And with the dredging that went on historically and the high silt inputs we got into our rivers, some of these species are finding it hard to find their spawning habitats. These are the things that are making it through. Those fish that live a long time. Minnows can live up to 10 years quite commonly. I was surprised to find that. Brown trout are quite fast in their rate of maturity, and they may fade away after 5 years. They can live 10 plus years, but it's thought that the chalk stream brown trout don't actually live that long. So you can get this skewing in populations, because if we have a low flow year, 1, 2, 3, with trout, they don't sexually mature until about second year. They might start to die after the 5th year. So they've got to have sort of years 4 and 5 to be good. Well, if we're not getting good flows very regularly, they might not find the flow that they need and the habitat they need to actually reproduce. Whereas chub might live 20 years. They can play it for a long game. And they can also spawn multiple times throughout the summer when they've got a good year. Low flows, it means we get more barriers. This is the Foxton to Barrington Bridge. When I was younger, that water used to come gushing out of there and there was no barrier. Now, a fish, if it swims up here in the hard concrete, it's clunch bed there actually, how is it going to jump? It cannot get the depth to get up there. So you've got this barrier here. And ironically, the very thing that the Environment Agency use to measure the flow in our rivers are also quite significant barriers. So they can tell us a drought, and yeah, we can say there's a drought, but with this at the top of the River Granta, fish can't get further upstream towards Bartlow when the flow's good, crystal clear water there. But the problem on the River Granta as well is you've got a gauging station down here at Stapleford, and that's also a barrier. When the river's up high, yes, you might think fish can swim through, but when that's belting through, imagine how much energy you've got to use to swim up there. So it's much safer for fish to swim and move at lower flows, or when the flow's optimum, than to try and push through in a flood flow. And that's, again, one of the reasons that's causing this lack of distribution in our fish species, because our rivers simply aren't the same as they were 40 years ago. Without that cleansing flow, we get problem plants like this. That's a plant called azolla, Chinese water fern. If that Hoffer brook was flowing swiftly, that plant would get flushed out. It wouldn't be able to dominate the water surface like that. But when we've got low flows, almost static flow, that can form a complete carpet over it. It's stopping all of the light penetrating into the water, driving that ecosystems of plants on the riverbed. And it also causes deoxygenation of the water underneath it. So Chinese water fern or azolla is a big problem. We get it on the River Mell at times too, but it's turned up in the Hoffer Brook in recent times. When we don't have flow in our streams, people take it upon themselves to re-engineer them. We're lucky it hasn't been put in a pipe. This is part of the Hoffer Brook at Newton. That was taken, look at the date, 20 years ago I took that photograph. I don't know what it's like now, but I bet when you had a wet year, there's more water in that channel than it could hold. So he's probably got it wrong, but that's sad to see our streams being encased in brickwork. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail about my work I've been involved in at Granta, the Babham Research Park on the River Granta. As I said, it came out from a request from the campus after the drought of 2019 to know how they could manage their river better. They wanted to take care of it. I'd already established a relationship with the estates manager there when I was at the district council. I'd undertaken some habitat improvement works with his support. And they got me on board. I undertook an advisory visit for them. They were interested in ideas I talked about in terms of managing the tree canopy better, improving some of the previous work the Environment Agency had undertaken for them. And I took those ideas and I worked them up into a project proposal. So I then came forward with a plan. Well, what's really bad, first of all? Those rivers there, to me, look pretty bad. They might not look too bad to yourselves, but what's wrong about these? You only have one clump of marginal plants there. You've got a very incised channel. It goes from high dry ground, where the nettles are growing, straight down into the water. No aquatic plants. Here, you've got trailing nettles. Up here, you've got shaded. It becomes wide. There's nothing much going on there except a small flow deflector there that's put in by the Environment Agency to trial something. It doesn't look good. That's not how a chalk stream should be. Remember that picture of actually the Bourne Rivulet, tributary of the Test, where you had nice sloping margins coming down. We had bright, clean gravel. We had diversity of water plants. That is basically on its knees. We've got shaded banks that are downwashing with fine silt and earth particles. So that's putting in more silt. Every time it rains, you're getting this material washing into the river, smothering those gravels where invertebrates should be living, trout eggs should be incubating and maturing. We've got another part of the Granta here, nice patch of clean gravel, but the fence is even falling in, so this bank is becoming eroded, probably due to signal crayfish. And all in all, the public walking past it wouldn't even know this bit of the river is here. So you've got this complete disconnection. If we are to get people to take care of their environment, they've got to know it. They've got to feel like they've got a duty and an interest to take care of it. So we've also got, these are some of the works, and what I'm pointing out here is this shaggy long wire. You can see dogs are sliding down this bank. So some of these features, where you've got these trailing wires, are the kind of works I'll be working with the Babham Research Campus staff to just improve, to make them better. So all in all, there's quite a few things at the Babham Research Campus that could be improved. And so with my project proposal, what I tried to do for the site was say, you've got some good areas, but there's a lot of potential down here in the woods, away from the campus, where we could really quite go to town. If we could get some machines in, we could reshape those riverbanks. We could try and get that river connecting with more of its floodplain. And you see here, the river's been straightened in front of Babram Hall. The natural course of the river, I would guess, would be snaking across here, because the floodplain is actually lower over here than it is over there. I think, I don't know, but I think it was probably moved to a higher point of the valley to establish a water meadow system years ago, which would have irrigated the land to get the early bite of grass to support more sheep. But we are now left with the River Granta being left at the edge of its valley, and we have low parts here. So I came up with an idea. We also got fish passage issues. We've got a big weir here and an environment agency gauging station there, so fish cannot move up over those. I looked at their section of river and I wrote them a detailed report with lots of pictures, but these kind of bullet pointed maps are the main things. On there you can see I'm saying create a 2-stage channel here, create a gravel riffle, bend over the trees for habitats, use a dredging pile. In other words, that gravel that was moved, taken from the river 30, 40 plus years ago, put some of that back in, be bold, reshape that river, create low parts and remove the levees and allow that to spread out here, get it to connect to some old ponds that are in this woodlands. So it's basically all systems go. I worked up a plan. The Environment Agency's flood and coastal risk management function actually came forward with just under £20,000, which is why this work had to be focused on floodplain connection, slowing the flow, making space for water, and also getting that water onto the floodplain and allow it to soak into land naturally to give some of this aquifer recharge, not just send that water all the way down to the hill to here in Stapleford where you have flooding problems. If there's space upstream, use that space if it's not threatening communities there. So we have the typical dry bank covered with nettles, the hidden part of the river down here. We get a big 14-ton excavator in that can reach about 8 metres, and we dig. We've created basically a little bay here, which when the river floods out, it can just fill up into that area. We've also regraded the top of the bank there. So when it really floods up, it can take a more of a preferential pathway off to the right and find the lowland, which is in this woodland. But the keen-eyed amongst you will notice there's a tree across the river here. And the next slide is going to be about that. I've also put in lots of shaggy features along the edge here. We tried to twist and turn this, but that's another story in itself. But we put in shaggy features because it's that roughness at the edge where small fish, whether they be sticklebacks or trout fry, need to take shelter from elevated flows. And I'm not always talking about flood flows. Many fish find it hard to swim against a fast current. And why would they? Because they're exposed to predators, they're exposed to energy demands, and all in all, they'll end up being washed downhill. So we need our rivers to be shaggy. We've now wildflower seeded this area here, but I've got a little pictures, big and bold, I said. Let's cut down a tree. Let's pick that tree up and let's put it over the river so it can slow it up. I've trimmed it up a bit, but I've kept this top of the tree there. There's a gravel bar there forming. That's another story which I'll come on to. But in the flood, it does that. You can actually see there's a bit of a higher flood level here. But you can see the water turbulence there. So that tree is acting as a break in the river. Trees naturally fall on the rivers. That's what the beaver campaign is partly for now. Trees are a natural part of our river's ecosystem, but man has taken them out as we've thought they've been dangerous. But if we can slow that passage of water all the way down the hill, we've got a much better riverine environment. And here you go. It's after the flood. It hasn't been washed away. It's quite secure. What it's done, it's actually caused bed scour. And you can see these gold and gravel bars started to merge. So it started to force that flow down. And it's got bed turning over. And it's going to make that river undulate as well as wiggle from side to side. Rivers should not flow straight and rivers should not flow flat. They should go up and down and side to side. Another elevation. You can see some of the river dredgings are here. They were gravelly enough that I was prepared to put them in the river. But yes, they did carry quite a lot of sand. But I knew that the Granta here has got enough energy to sort and shift that sand. Keen eyes, you'll see I've marked the bank here, ready for the excavator to come along. Ta-da. And that's just based on my measuring up the cross sections and then my best judgment on site when I had one man who's very skilled driving an excavator, one man running a dumper who also acted as my labourer, and a team of tractor and trailer drivers from the Babram estate. Ends up like that. So suddenly a river that people couldn't get close to, we've got space for water where it can spill out onto these areas, this two-stage channel. We've got new marginal habitats that are evolving. This area again has been wildflower seeded, which is why the barrier went up last year, really to stop people flattening the plants. And we've got a gravel bar been built out there, and there's another gravel bar down here. So we're trying to make that bed flow up and down as well. This is how we form some of the gravel bars. We actually dredge the riverbed where it's right to do it. This is a technique that's being called dig and dump. So we can dig out gravelly material and we can place it carefully in the river to form new gravel bar features. So we're not importing all of our material, we can redistribute it within the river. We're not dredging it, we're not removing it and dumping it on the bank, we're digging it out very carefully and putting it in to make these sort of shoulder-like features at the edge of the river, which then pushes the flow. I might have wanted to dig it up here, but that plant there is all water crowfoot, so I didn't. To be quite honest with you, I was hoping I'd find lots of gravel bars and seams within this soil, but being on the edge of the floodplain, I was digging in valley alluvium. So I was bringing up materials more like chocolate cake rather than nice rich gravel seams. But we did find some when we were digging it, and that's why this looks quite sandy at the moment, but it's flushed through in the winter, and we've got nice gravel bars forming. If you keep your eye on that building there, again, my dots, 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 blues along there. Here's one of the gravel bars, and here it is more closely. That, in April it was formed. By late May, it had hundreds of minnows spawning on there. They were just waiting to find a feature like that. And what I've also done, as the water comes off that, it's sped up, and it's being pushed under that bramble patch there, which is just the ideal place where a large trout would want to hang out. It's got cover from above, it's got a ready source of food coming its way, and it's got well-oxygenated water. So you're providing a brown trout with all it needs in terms of food, shelter, and somewhere to breed, which will be on this clean gravel bar. Who would even know there was a chalk stream, one of the UK's most important habitats, behind that bramble hedge? Ends up looking like that. Quite a pleasant little stream. I have supplemented some of that gravel there by the dig and dump approach. We use fir tree tops here because we had fir trees on site, so it's simply the easiest thing to use. But again, I don't like to leave edges hard and bare, so we used whatever materials available. I've also bent over by tree hinging, similar to hedge laying, some of the marginal black form. That's what this stump end there is. So it's not dead. I've just taken it, partially cut it through, bent it over, so you've got instant overhead cover and also flow deflection off of that feature. This is where probably dozens of people walk every day. How many of those people did ever see over this hedge? None. A very dark, unloved looking part of the River Granta ends up looking like that. Note where this, my wife actually, is standing in that low spot, that very carefully engineered low spot. Ta-da! When the river came up into flood on the 27th of December, I raced out there and got some photos and was very pleased to see that my judgment, my experience, my call on where the machine should be digging enabled the River Granta to start to connect sideways to its floodplain. I don't know if you get the picture here, but the land is just dropping away. It's just ripe for cutting through that part of the river bank. Let that water spread out and reconnect to its floodplain. So that's what that bump is if you walk along this part of the river's for. It's actually a swale which conveys floodwater to the rest of its catchment and floodplain. That was just the view looking back up here. So it's a good passageway for water. I'm really pleased with that. And we've got a few other parts on the river that were breaching like that. Some haven't yet come into effect. They need a bigger flood. But it's working. That's the main point. I also realise that the public do enjoy our rivers, and you can't tell people to go away very easily. You have to work with them. And if you've got a footbridge, that is going to be a focus. That's going to be where children want to throw pool sticks off, where dogs will come running down the bank and will bounce around in the river looking for their sticks. but it was a major input of silt and sediment. And basically it was eroding back and the stream was becoming wider, and it was all in all, it was taking quite a battering. So I thought, how can I make this more resilient to people and dogs? I don't want to push them off of here. So what I did, I got tree trunks and I used one post behind them, one simple loop of wire around them, but all of those tree trunks are underwater. I wouldn't want to expose those tree trunks because they become very slippery when they get worn and they get algae on them. If I can have them underwater, there's less of a trip hazard and a slip hazard there for people. And then when we regrade the bank back, we pulled that back and we brought in some clean gravel, mixed it with sandy gravel, and we effectively formed, I dare say, a beach-like feature, but it's a natural shoal. It's just become more resilient. It's providing the public with somewhere that's clean and safe to enjoy the stream. And hopefully it's a place where they'll make memories, become attached to the River Granta. Remember that lovely summer's afternoon we had playing in the stream. How is it now? What can we do? How can we help that river? It becomes something like this. Here's the play area. Here's the bridge where people can stand and enjoy and see what's going on. But here's some of my shagginess. I don't want them all coming all further downstream. I've given them somewhere to play. So I put branches in the edge. And you find that stops some dogs. We've got some flow deflectors in, pinching the flow, making it throttle through here. But that's worked. Now we've given them somewhere to enjoy. We've used natural fallen woody material to control where else they go. I also put tree trunks across the river in places. This is lower than some of the trees you saw at the top of the channel. But this one, what's great about this is this winter, it caught another large log that came coming down the river. It's all jammed up there. Log jams are a natural feature of our river. I can't see a single property there that's going to get flooded, so there's no real flood risk. The farming company on the other side were quite happy to accept occasional inundation, and actually it didn't flood out there this winter. The floods were not that big. But what's happened, as the water's come throttling through here, through that pinch point, it's blown out the bed, and you can see another gravel bar forming there. So again, we've got bed undulation, we've got sediment transport, we've got sediment sorting from your sand, your grit, your gravel, your larger cobbles, and now fish can find the right spawning habitat, whether they want sandy areas or clean gravel or a large rock to hide under if you're a bullhead fish. That little log jam is so important. But the mindset for river management used to be, the trees fall in the river, we better take it out. Trees in rivers in some locations are absolutely critical. They're not suitable in every location, and that's the balance that landowners have to make and bodies like the Environment Agency. But we at the Wild Trout Trust love putting safe trees back into rivers. Again, similar thing, lots of people, mainly dogs as well, enjoying this part of the river, sliding down the river bank. But it's not really got much going for it, this bit. So we put a lot of tree tops in to slow the flow, to cause some of the silt to drop out on the inside of that meander. I formed a strong toe to that bank using hazel faggot bundles, brushwood bundles of sticks tied together, mimicking that root system you'd have along the edge of a riverbank. I've then worked in a sandy mix of gravel so it's resilient to dogs and children jumping on it. We even put a step up there for them to step onto. So again, I'm not trying to tell them to move off of a site. I'm trying to manage it better for them. And I've even put a seat up there so that people can enjoy this part of the river. But what they can't see in this photograph, we've lowered the bank just there. And when this comes up in flood, it floods over this way and into one of the dry ponds just in the woodland here. So we've got good floodplain connection, and there's actually a big flow deflector here, which is this feature. And we've got a lovely gravel bar forming just here where it erodes back and is eroding quite a high cliff there. High cliff erosion is good because what bird nests in the cliff? Kingfishers. And some of our Cambridgeshire rivers are so flat in this lowland landscape that high bank features are important for kingfisher nest sites. And that's actually what I'm trying to encourage here. So we've got a smaller excavator in. This is a 6-ton machine. We've fixed a large tree trunk here, this feature. We've backfilled it so when it comes up in flood, it doesn't come over here with high velocities and scour out this material. I've packed it full of brushwood to slow that flow. What this is trying to do is push this clean flow against that bank, because that bank has got gravel in it, and I want that bank to erode out, get a little bit more meander and maybe add another 5 tons of natural gravel, so it can start that transport of sediment down the river and start the river to actually form its own features of gravel bars, riffles, deeper pool habitats and high cliff habitats. This is a flow deflector in our classic sense of it. If you ever hear about flow deflectors, it's basically a large gnarly log pinned to the riverbed. And what it does, it creates an area of faster flowing water and scour. And those flow deflectors, when you become experienced and established and put in them, you can cause a straight channel to start to meander. And you get, of course, pockets of slower water, pockets of faster water. So you're getting differential currents, which causes your fine particles to settle out in the calmer water and clean bed scour happening in the faster areas. This is just showing how I've used fawny material, again, to try and control where the dogs are going. This is a hawthorn tree that I bent over, hedge laying technique, to try and protect this shallow area. There weren't many parts of the River Granter at Baybram where we've got nice shallows with water crowfoot growing, lesser water parsnip and exposed gravel bars. So I thought that's so special, I wanted to keep the dogs off of it. I then laid hawthorn material to stop the dogs running all over this whilst it's becoming established. It works to an extent in terms that it managed to withstand all of the floods this winter, but someone's taken the other stuff here. So, you know, you have to work with people. Someone's dog probably loves jumping in that bit, but at least it's not running all the way around here every day now. So we get some stability of habitats, some mature plants growing, and hopefully whichever fish are in that deeper pool now won't get scared twice a day when the dog's being walked. So it's, you know, it's a bit of give and take on some of these situations. Now we're down onto the River Mimram at Panshanger Park. This fisherman is standing in a deep hole for the Mimram because it's an over-wide chalk stream. It's about 8 to 10 metres wide. It's got beautiful gravel bed, but the deeper holes are only forming where natural tree fall has happened. So that tree has fallen in the river. As the flow has come to hit that, it's been forced down and it's blown out this gravel hole here. That's naturally what our chalk rivers should be like. They should be a system of braided channels snaking across the landscape with trees falling in them, which maybe every winter will push the flow this way and that. This is what beavers would be doing to our river landscapes. They'd be taking down lots of trees and causing our rivers to move again, which is good in some situations, but maybe not so good in urban environments. But this part of the Mimram in Panshanger Park is really quite special. How do you go about improving that? You replicate the natural processes that are happening. So, with the blessing of Tarmac, who own Panshanger Park, and the Herts and Middlesex Wildlife Trust, I undertook a tree assessment for bat roosts because I got permission to fell 26 trees into the river, pretend I was being a beaver. But of course, I wanted to make sure I'd chosen those trees with no to low bat roost potential. So in other words, those ones are safe enough to fell. I didn't want to be felling bat roosts. That'd be highly embarrassing. So I made a record of what I'd done. We numbered the trees and we got busy. This is what we're replicating, remember? Natural tree fall. In a woodland, a wooded chalk river, it would only be when you get those natural tree falls that you'd get light coming into the river. Naturally, our chalk streams wouldn't be this lush habitat that we've become so attached to. They would be quite wooded streams with occasional lush areas where the canopy broke. What I want you to focus on is this tree here that's bending down. That's a bit of a focal point. Again, very little marginal growth because the river's overshaded, very little flow diversity, very little depth cover. That river is actually only about 20 centimetres deep. So as a trout fishery, it might look good from a distance, but it's absolutely rubbish when you get into it because there are sections there that are 20, 40 metres that are not holding nearly as many fish as they could do. And the fish species, and they're not just trout, they're grayling, they're pike, they're stone loach, they're bullhead, they're lamprey. But we wanted to put the shagginess back into it. So we fell trees like this. I'm not dropping them all in the river. I want to mimic that kind of, it looks like nature's come upon it. And then we use the tree tops to make these brushwood habitats, marginal ledges. And we're starting to get more differing water pathways. And we've got little areas where flood rack, in other words, organic debris is building up as it's catching those branches. That organic matter is so important for invertebrates like shrimp, which shred those leaves, shred that organic matter, which in turn feed the fish. If you get pockets of calmer water, then you'll get sand settling out. That sand is the habitat where mayfly will burrow into. You need stable silt and sandbars. Sand and silt, rather, is very important for brook lamprey to find their areas where their larvae mature. So these guys are wiring some of those features into place. We don't want them to wash out in the first high elevated flows of winter. We've got effectively a little mid-channel island here, but look how the water velocity is speeding up there. We've got another little log here just to trip up the flow and push it this way, a fallen tree limb that way. It looks a bit shaggy, but to me, it's becoming more natural. There's that same branch. So we've got a mid-channel island, we've got pathways coming this way, we've got pathways that way. So we actually got more length of river because you've got this riverbank, you've got a riverbank there, a riverbank there, and a riverbank there, instead of it just being one over wide, shallow, homogeneous channel. Here's one we made earlier, quite shaggy. Many people think that's an untidy river. That's an ecologically diverse river. You don't need to know what's going on in there, but look at these different flow pathways. You've got trees coming into the river. You've got treetops trailing. So you've got good marginal habitats, differing flow pathways, lots of calmer waters that if this river comes up in flood, fish can take that shelter. When those fish juveniles are hatching out and they can't swim against this faster flow here, they'll be living in there. And I'll come on to that in a moment. Our trees just sort of hanging into the water, like flow deflectors, but also like those trees that came down into the river. So we're just taking a lead from nature. This is a meander, but it's a very over-wide meander. I want you to note very little flow diversity here. So we get the fishing club in, we get a lot of brash, we pack all that brash, which effectively branches with leaves on, we pack it all in. We put the odd little log in to push the flow. Already the flow rate is picking up as it's being swung around the outside at meander, like when you swing a friend around in the playground, they're moving faster. And what's happening instantaneously is the sand is being separated from the gravel. It's the way the physics operate. It's the way the river has to do its thing. So we're straight away getting sediment sorting, differing flow pathways establishing, which means different ecological niches. You've got flow water, fast water habitats here, slow water where the finest sand is settling out, and then this brash will entrain the fine sediment that will come down through the winter. Just look how it's picked up. That meander is now starting to work a lot better for its river in terms of the diversity of ecological habitats. It's just looking right. Here's one I made with the angling club about 2 years earlier. That was all the way back to there. This is all brash, which then become vegetated over. There's a log here. These are actually trout spawning areas in front. That's what's cleaned up the riverbed there as they cut into the riverbed. When we did the fish survey, we didn't find the fish in the river. We found the fish in the brash because there's water flowing through that network of branches, and that's where the juvenile trout were living. That trout is what we call 0+. That's the young of the year. So that would have been spawned in December. When this first fish survey was undertaken in July, that fish is then basically about 6 to 7 centimetres long. That doesn't want to live in the fast flow. It can't very easily. It's susceptible to predation. It's going to compete against the adults. If it can live in there where it's packed full of invertebrates, got that woody material keeping herons and egrets and kingfishers off its head, that's the best place for it to be when it's small. That's a great sign, and that's why we've carried on with this approach on the River Mimram, because we know it's going to give us results. To the close eye, that might be a trout red. Where the flow is speeding up here, that might be a trout red. There's no ifs or buts about this one. That was a tree trunk I put across the river. It's forced that flow down against the bed, so it's caused bed scour. Those fish that are looking for suitable spawning areas can feel that flow. So the female has cut into the riverbed. using her tail sideways to pull and move the gravel, she's formed this large the nest into which she's shed some eggs. The males fertilise them, then she's covered them over the gravel. So that's a really good sign that in its first year, I've got wild brown trout spawning in that part of the River of Imram. I'm going to touch upon the River Gwash at Stamford, because it shows another technique that's very applicable to the Cambridgeshire rivers, in terms that we have quite deep rivers. That river is actually over my waist, but by summertime, the margins are grown in. The reason for that is you haven't got high scouring flows that push that marginal growth to the sides. What happens is the river gets engulfed by the vegetation to a point where it reaches a kind of balance in the middle, but it's not quite got enough velocity to scour the bed clean. If you bring that bed up, it then starts to look more like this. So here, we've brought the gravel bar right the way across, and we've developed a pool and a mini riffle system. We've got that bed undulating, and that flow velocity, as it's elevated, it pushes against those reeds at the edges, and it physically stops them from encroaching out into the channel. That's how it works. If you dig a river that's over deep, you've lost the velocity, you've lost the ability of that river to cleanse itself, you've lost the ability of that river to flush out plants, and all that happens is someone calls for it to be dredged and the cycle to be repeated. And you end up in this negative feedback situation where your river's broken. It's not transporting silt, it's not really conveying flood flows efficiently, and it's not a very nice place for wildlife to be. So we want to rebuild our rivers. That's a little sound bite. On that river, it took about 200 tons of gravel to restore 100 metres. That's a big, high cost, but it could be worth it in some situations. Same part of the River Gwash. Keep your eye on that little copse there. I've widened the river, massively widened it to shallow up there, so it comes around here and hits that bank and forms a pool. That's what that needed, because I know naturally the River Gwash was coming around here, so we had a pool habitat on the meander. It would have thrown up gravel, which would have then dropped out here as a depositional zone, widened, and then drop off and round again. Rivers need to go up and down, they need to wiggle from side to side. If they don't, they're broken. And of course, I got involved with the anglers themselves on this one. Keep your eye on that Lombardy poplar. We can only do so much with a long reach excavator. It's a very good machine, but you still need these guys to rake that gravel into place, stomp it in place with their feet and compact it down and get it fine-tuned. So keep your eyes on Lombardy poplar. There's a happy angler. He's happy because he's catching wild trout. No need to stock it. If you make the habitat, the species will come. But what you also need to realise is the vegetation's not encroaching out, albeit it's probably a slightly different month, but that river is actually starting to meander within its new channel form that we've established for it. And it doesn't need the river keeper there to go back and pull back that marginal cover so the fishermen can get at their quarry. Okay, I'm happy to pause there. That's a natural stop point. I could talk about the River Lark after this, but I think I've probably talked enough. What I want to emphasise is we are the Wild Trout Trust, but we're not just about trout. We're about the whole river ecosystem, whether it be from the predatory pike right down to roach, grayling, minnows, sea trout, and bullheads. Thank you.
Rob, thank you very much. I suspect that for many of us, as for me, Rob has changed my perception. I've always understood the importance of the chalk streams, but never quite understood why. And I was fascinated your emphasis on them being man-made, and clearly they depend on the right sort of management.
Yeah.
Like many, I see a tree across the river, I assume that somebody ought to come along and clear it. Not me. Evidently, that's not necessarily the case. I love the idea of shaggy banks, which I hadn't thought of before. I was also particularly impressed that you recognise the need for people to be able to appreciate the rivers if we're to manage them effectively. And that means, of course, being able to see them and to access them. And I'm sure there are areas we can improve that. So I'm sure that Rob has stimulated lots of comment and questions both in the room and at home. Claire, well, are you able to tell me when there are people wanting to speak from at home? Anyone want to start off the conversation? I would stress these are conversation events. Go ahead, just remind us of your name. I'm sorry, I forgot.
Katie.
Katie, please. Yes.
So you were talking about the great plant diversity on the banks. Has there been any assessment of like the impact of pollinators and how restoring river habitat is positive?
I don't believe there's been any detailed assessments. The Environment Agency or the predecessors, National Rivers Authority, used to undertake river corridor surveys, and I think that was the early 1990s where they were mapping. I think that I know that the Wildlife Trust has undertaken some assessments along watercourses like the River Ree, but mainly focus on water voles and noting down what plants. But there's other botanists. There's Sylvia Haslam, who was undertaking surveys in the 80s. And when I met her at the Cam Valley Forum, she was very shocked. And Charles Turner, Dr. Charles Turner, will also talk about the great plant loss from the River Cam. They said there are many more pond weeds. That's my mind's going blank. It's the, I'll come to me now. No, it's gone. But basically, species diversity is known to be declined in the River Cam. Whether that's due to a type of river management being repeated, then if you change river management, so one river management can sustain and support some certain types of plant communities. If you then change that management, you might have lost one set of plant communities with the river management you've undertaken. And then if you change it again, that river management affects another plant community. And I'm talking about herbicide here. So where some of our marginal plants were being controlled by herbicide, they might have been knocked back. And then if you change your plant management again, some of the plants won't have come back quick enough to have literally got their heads up to flower, repopulate and redistribute. And I think that's causing a slow decline. So we're ending up the big tough plants. The River Ree, when I was younger, used to be crystal clear. And I mentioned how the crayfish have come in, and I don't see the unbranched fur reed anymore. That's Sparganium erectum. That appears to have massively declined in the River Ree. I do think it's because there's less light penetrating. So when that plant should be growing up from the riverbed in May time, it might be there's not enough sunlight penetrating to drive its growth. Or it might be that the crayfish are in there and they are physically eating the plant fragments before they can get going. So we have got these changes that are happening. I couldn't put my finger on all of them, but it is becoming less diverse, and water quality will affect that as well.
Very interesting what you say about clarity. I think that's something that a lot of us have noticed in a number of places. Even now at the recreation ground in Great Shelford, but certainly in Grantchester too. Yeah. And that's obviously a number of factors.
It's complex. There's a number of factors. Yeah.
And you mentioned the role of effluents. And I'm wondering to what extent we're talking about untreated effluents being emitted, as I think has shocked many of us. Or is this actually treated effluent, which was always designed to be going into the rivers?
I'm not going to talk in great detail about it because I don't know the detail. No. The Cam Valley Forum are really getting to grips with it. But the water company will say that it has been treated to an extent in terms that they've screened it. So they are physically removing the large, unsightly products from it. But other than it being aerated and stored in the tank for a while, it's not very pleasant.
But the clarity does seem to come back at times. I haven't noticed it coming back at Grantchester.
It tends to come back around this time of year.
Yes. Why is that? Is that just the flow rate? Or?
It's because after the winter high flows, we start to get all the silts have been flushed through the system, and we get this period of slowing flows as the water starts to drop. And so the water clarity can improve until we get the higher temperatures and higher sunlight in the summer, and then we get algal blooms.
Right.
And algae tends to come up, these brown globular algae. It rises off the riverbed, often in sort of late April and early May time. When it flows over weirs, the brown globular algae breaks up and you get lots of diatoms in the water. And then it starts to affect the water clarity.
Anyone else want to come back to you?
Kate, it's the Potamogeton species of pondweeds.
Right.
The Potamogetons, there used to be a lot more of them in the Cam.
Okay.
I was wondering, how will we get rid of the invasive crayfish? And how do we protect the populations of the native crayfish?
I think we have almost lost the fight of the native crayfish in the riverine system in the Cam catchment now, because we were too slow. They were known that they were disappearing. I recorded them disappearing, got David Rogers, one of the country's experts, to confirm it in 2000. The authorities did very little other than think about where they could try and establish arc sites. But because we already had such a wide distribution of signal crayfish in this county, nobody could decide or knew where they should be moving them to. Because there's always felt, well, there might be a population of signal crayfish relatively nearby. Otters can move across the landscape. Herons can move across the landscape. There was nowhere felt here to be truly safe. There is a population of them in an irrigation reservoir in the upper Ree catchment, and they haven't been affected for the last 20 years. There may be some very, very small riverine populations where the population was so small that the disease didn't get passed on. It was shockingly quick how it came down the Cam and the Ree system. Well, it's actually the Ree and its headwater systems. And there was a population that was in the Cam at Hinxton, which some fishermen said was dying 5 or 6 years ago. It might be we had another outbreak of the plague then. But I know for a fact that not all of the signal crayfish were carrying the fungal disease. We used to have them living side by side in the Shep in the late 1990s, and then the plague turned up and the natives all disappeared. So coming down to how can we protect them, I simply don't know how we can protect our white-clawed crayfish unless we move them to ponds which are truly isolated. And I'm not at all a believer in trying to control signal crayfish by trapping. It can work if you're very, very intensive, but as soon as you stop that pressure, that animal has got the capacity to bounce back, and it will come back in almost similar numbers within a few years because the habitat's there. And also, if you're trapping crayfish, the animals you tend to capture are the bigger, more dominant animals. You take away the bigger, more dominant animals, which are predating upon their own, you end up with a population explosion of younger, smaller animals that then go forward and distribute, or reproduce rather. But let's come back to kind of natural control. What can eat crayfish? Herons, otters, big predatory fish, perch, chub, brown trout, pike. Why don't we try and get our fish populations better so we have more competition and predation naturally on the signal crayfish rather than man trying to go around and pick these and control these animals? Let's get our rivers more resilient to these species rather than having broken rivers that we then find going even further backwards when we have a non-native species turn up, which all it's doing is taking advantage of the opportunity which we're presenting to it. And if you've got a broken ecosystem, well, another species is only going to swing it another way. There are some suggestions, like on the River Kennet, the crayfish numbers might be dropping now because maybe the fish populations after several decades have started to get sort of on balance with them again. But I'm certainly not seeing that situation in the River Ree. And they are signal crayfish along the Cam. I found them at Whittlesford alongside the Spices factory. I've had reports of them right up at Saffron Walden. They're down at Hawkston. But the powers that be didn't believe they were all over the place. But we know they are now, and it's really probably too late to start trying to stop them from getting to some places.
Come back on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's fascinating and sad to hear about the native crayfish, but very interesting what you're saying about managing. I hadn't realised that pike predated on the crayfish.
Many animals will try and eat them.
No, Tommy, do we have anyone on the chat wanting to join in?
We have John. Do you want me to read out his question, or are you able to put him on the screen?
John, are you happy for us to read out your question? I think it may be easier to manage it that way if you don't mind.
Yes, okay, go ahead.
It's quite loud and clear, actually.
It's not very clear now.
You go ahead, John, in that case, since we can hear you so clearly.
Okay, well, it's really about the amount of water in the granter. It might go up and down, but it also disappears completely. A few summers ago, and I can't give you the exact year, but I was actually able to walk on the riverbed from the footbridge you showed towards the footbridge a little bit further downstream, and there was no water there at that particular area at all. And any fish that might get in there, of course, won't be able to do anything because there's no water to do anything into. So how can you allow for these problems that occur when there's no water? particularly in global warming times where extra water is going to transpire and evaporate. And we've got extra housing coming into the area, which will mean more abstraction from the aquifer. I understand they did try and pump some water in at Linton, but that just disappeared down before it got anywhere near Babraham. So all this good work you've done, how can we secure it?
It's by managing our water use. I'm trying to say more sustainably, but it sounds pathetic because we haven't managed that so far. There is also another factor to be aware of. I've been led to believe, but I don't know any more knowledge on this, the geology changes in the Granter catchments. So it might be there's some gravel seams that cause the water to drop, but that water's only dropping because we have lowered the aquifer so much. It's the analogy of trying to pour water over a damp sponge. You might get some coming off the bottom of it. You try and pour that water over a dry sponge, it can only go into the into the bed. And so we haven't got the aquifer below the River Granter any longer to support its length, which is meant to be 22 kilometres from right up at Bartlow. And the Environment Agency do pump water into the headwaters, and you're absolutely right. It keeps it wet through Linton, but of course the weirs that are in Linton are slowing that flow up. They're causing it to warm, and it will sink into the ground. There was also another point of water being discharged into the Granter I noticed in 2019. But you're right, down at Stapleford, the riverbed was dried and cracked. It wasn't just slightly damp at times, it completely dried up, and their gauging station was bone dry and concrete. And I don't have a solution to that. They have got to stop. Well, I know what the solution is. They've got to stop taking so much water from the Granter catchment. Otherwise, that problem will happen time and time again. I would love to have put the Granter back onto its natural part of the floodplain, but that was beyond my remit of where we were at the moment. I can't dig up a woodland and rechannel a river just for 20 grand. That wouldn't happen. It needs a culture change. It needs people to badger the MPs, who in turn should badger Ofwat and should make us be paying a more relevant price for our water. Now, how do we pay such little on our water, but yet pay £2, £3 for a bottle of water that's been sold to us in a shop, and then won't pay more than 60p for a pint of milk? The economics of it are what could sort it out, but we want everything cheap.
I think Anthony Brown has been very keen on restoring the rivers.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is we have to go further than that. And
well, he is involved.
The cost of water.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ofwat have a strong hand to play in this as well, but they chose not to increase the cost. But many families also find it hard to to make ends meet at this time.
You talk about supplementing the flow up at Bartlow, but presumably that can only be done by
if you can find a source to
and therefore we're lowering the level in the aquifer. How serious is that we have so lowered the level in the aquifer?
I do not know.
Right.
This is the lunacy of that situation. It isn't sustainable, but at least it's keeping our rivers flowing at the moment, because you cannot keep taking water from the aquifer to try and mitigate water that's already been taken from the aquifer, because at some point you'll run out of water to take. Yes. But it's worked so far, and I would say at least it has kept our streams going for a generation, where we wouldn't be having these kind of talks and meetings about our Cambridgeshire rivers if that hadn't happened.
The role of possibly reservoirs,
yes,
and also pools for whether that's for crayfish or others. But how can we? Do we need to build more large reservoirs? Are you talking about small reservoirs to replace the extent to which we rely on pumping from the aquifer? Can we?
There's talk about creating a reservoir out in the fen system. And this also taps into the kind of philosophy that's called chalk streams first. Wouldn't it be wonderful? This is a philosophy taken forward by Charles Rangeley Wilson, chalk streams first, and some other experts. Wouldn't it be better if we allowed our rivers to flow naturally in terms of quantity and quality, and then we abstracted that water of good quality because we'd taken care of it, because we knew it was going to be our drinking water, lower down in the system? Instead of stealing it from the environment at the headwaters, why don't we take it when it's flowed past most of our towns before it goes out to sea with minimal treatment, because we'd kept it really good quality by having good landscapes and good road environments where we don't muck up our sewage and storm overflows. We don't allow all this first flush to come off the roads in the summer storm. That would be a much more sustainable way of managing our water resources, taking that water when it's flowed past our houses.
Yes, I don't know about others, I'm welcome more questions or comments, but it does seem to me, Claire coming in, that there are, I won't say solutions, but there are approaches that can work, but it depends on a better understanding of the river system and better cooperation perhaps.
And
you clearly have good cooperation with the fishermen. What about with farmers?
Farmers are very good nowadays. I'm certainly vouching around Cambridgeshire. I used to be able to look across from one village to another and you wouldn't see hedgerows, you wouldn't see buffer strips. I don't say that this part of the landscape we get a lot of soil runoff because we don't have the geology. We don't have the large maize crops being planted. It's a problem in some counties, but the farmers here in Cambridgeshire are actually doing a lot better for the environments now than they were a generation ago.
Claire.
Can I ask a supplementary question?
Oh, John, sorry.
Yeah, we talked really about how difficult it is to actually get fast change to protect the river flow. And I think it's going to be a long time before we can actually get everyone in agreement that we shouldn't extract more water. But I'd just like to ask the supplementary question of the reverse. We have a big car park that's been suggested for Babraham, for instance, and you get a lot of water coming off that. And I did protest about that at the time, and I gather they're going to try and stop some of that water. But how resilient would all the work you've done be to not only just a summer flood, but an extra flood created by a load of concrete for car parking in the area?
Straight away, it wouldn't be very resilient because that's not meant to be in the grantor catchment. I'm also quite irritated by the Southern Transport proposals. It's another one of these projects that's come upon us with not a great deal of scrutiny and not a great many options proposed as far as I can see. And it has a lot of pressures associated with it, especially when it's cutting across parts of the landscape that few of us have ever got to. So we're going to get a lot more public intrusion, a lot more pressure. And I do think they could be better in the way that they design these schemes. That water, it could go to natural infiltration areas. It could have water purifying ponds, reed beds, shallow spillways, take out the fine sediments to break down the hydrocarbons, then allow that water to soak back into the aquifer. I certainly don't want it coming out into a pipe system that then flushes off into the river and causes a pulse of water, grey, nasty water to go down the River Granter at the height of summer when the river's already stressed enough. It comes down to the desire and put enough money behind these schemes to get good quality infrastructure, and that needs strong leadership.
It also needs good consultation, and it's the GCP who announced this, and they made their decisions without actually a published environmental report, which really upset me that they didn't suggest that they're going to do something about some of the problems that have been raised about the River Granter. I think at the end of the day, it really means reducing development until we've got the water infrastructure, but no one really seems to be listening to that particular proposal. Rob, do you, as a matter of course, get any opportunity to put your own views in? Because you've got a lot of expertise that us lay people haven't got expertise, but do you get an opportunity to put your views into the consultation? Do they take more notice of you than us?
No, I'll say quite frankly, I'm trying to keep out of the planning world at the moment because my job is not a campaigning job. It's leading from the bottom up and using the skills and the limited resources I've got to motivate communities and people to do the kind of approach I'm doing. My job now is not to comment on planning, because I start commenting on planning, I'll be stuck in it for years. Some of these things take a lot of documents to read, a lot of consultations, and then you sometimes might put a lot of effort into a scheme just for it to be shelved. So my organisation doesn't have the resources to pay people like me and my colleagues to comment on planning. I might make comments personally, but yeah, unfortunately I've left that for other people to get involved in now and to lobby.
Claire, forgive me, but working with organisations like CPPF who are set up to lobby on these
Cambridge
things.
past, present and future.
Yes, you find you can work with organisations like that?
I've certainly given, it's, is it Littlewood's a surname?
James Littlewood?
Yeah, James.
Yes.
I've given him some input, but before him with Caroline Gola,
yes,
I used to work closely with her when I was at the district council. And James, I've given him a steer on some things, but yeah, they of course got the Hinkston Watermill, which is a beautiful site with challenges as well, but they've got their own part of the CAM with potential there.
On one of their open days, because actually there aren't that many spots where many of us get to visit the CAM, are there? And we're aware of it by the recreation ground in Great Shelford, or perhaps down by the the Environment Agency, what's it called, Clark's Piece.
Yes,
in
yeah, the gauging station bit there.
There are large sections of it, but we don't see, possibly because they're hidden. Claire, sorry, you keep trying to come in and I keep interrupting you.
No, just a very basic question really. As a group of local villagers who are interested in the health of our local rivers and wildlife, what can we do as individuals or as a group to help?
I would start coming up with a list of issues you think are important within your community. And that might be as simple as litter picking, getting people out into those bits, and maybe getting permission to go onto private land so people get to know more of their river within their community. Don't assume you can just walk onto people's lands, because somebody might have a precious area that's being used for their own purposes. It might be shooting of some type, or it might be strictly for nature conservation. So though you're trying to do good, establish links with landowners, see what some of their issues are. Think about fish passage. So have you got barriers that could be addressed so that fish can naturally colonize areas? Have you got marginal cover so you get species like water vole come in? Have you got features that are used by fish and invertebrates for reproduction, so gravel bars and riffles? Have you got areas where you can retain fallen trees? I've heard there's quite a large fallen tree upstream of the gauging station at the moment in Stapleford.
I thought it had been cleared.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I was just about to say whoopee.
One of those cases where I thought we must clear that.
It's not my business. Someone's told me, and I would say fantastic.
Yes.
Because it would have been providing a bit of habitat. It might cause bed scour. But also, if it's right in front or upstream of the gauging station, it would wedge up in front of the gauging station and affect their flow reading ability. So there are times when things have to be taken out, but could some of the logs have been left at the edge so you got some marginal habitat? Think of a tree as an underwater reef. The tree has got massive surface area. So those branches are where bacteria and fungi will be finding colonies. That algae will then be grazed by snails, shrimps and other mayfly larvae will be in there. Things don't want to just swim in open water. You've got to give them cover. They'll come into open water when there's a reason to be there, like feeding, but most of the time they'll be sheltering under undercut banks. So try and avoid that U-shaped channel, incised, and get it like that. So it's got nice adaptable margins. So as the water level goes up and down, you've got this varying wetness at the margins, which will give more ecological niches for plants. Then plants will bring all manner of other wildlife.
I'm going to hand the mic next to Kate again. Can I just remind those at home, if you want to contribute as John has done, do let us know on the chat, and Claire's keeping an eye on that.
I just wanted to ask, because you were talking about, we've got to get people to care about whether they get them stuff. What are, I don't know, the World Trout Trust, the Environment Agency, any of the organisations affiliated with this, doing to actually engage young people? Because I've been born and grown up in Cambridgeshire, and I can tell you that the vast majority of young people from my generation, younger, older, just don't know about any of this.
Well, you need to get involved with some of the community groups. So the River Mell Restoration Group did have youngsters going out with it. When I was doing a lot more work at weekends with the Friends of the River Shep, I've taken quite a number of youngsters out who've done their constant community engagement for their Duke of Edinburgh Awards. Find it. There are groups, there are people who work with you. We at the Wild Trout Trust, we take out some of our members and we take them out on hands-on volunteer sessions. We also have, not here in Cambridge, we have Trout in the Town initiative. So it's been more in the Somerset ways. I can't remember exactly the town that my colleague Theo Pike is taking forward, but in Sheffield, Paul Gaskell has been working there. And those groups have got more youngsters involved. I did try to connect with the Cambridge Eco Council, but that didn't happen this year. Again, it's been such a weird period when I'm just trying to be establishing myself in the Wild Trout Trust, and we get this period where you can't engage with people. We can work with youngsters, but in my type of work, it's quite physical. You might be in deeper water and really working with youngsters who aren't strong enough or maybe safe enough to put in a river environment. It's not always ideal. Because I might be lifting heavy items, I might be driving quite strong posts into the riverbed, and you've got to have people who are quite aware of the dangers of that. So it's not always ideal for youngsters, but I do like to work with youngsters. I've had a number of people who've changed career and gone into ecology because they've been inspired. But you're absolutely right.
any links with the Duke of Edinburgh Award scheme?
I don't at the moment. I used to all in my own time on Saturdays, so it wasn't what I was doing when I was at the council. I was dreaming about it in work time and then doing it at the weekends, and then the Wild Trout Trust took me on. Now I'm too tired at the weekends.
Yeah. I mean, so this is going to come across as a
Yeah,
challenge.
how can we make it happen is probably what you're thinking then.
Yeah, because it's all very well getting kids who are already doing Duke of Edinburgh, who are already in like ecologically minded families who are part of the Trout Trust. But
I want to get some youngsters out into the Bin Brook in Cambridge. That's where I wanted to get some of the Cambridge Eco Schools Council. The offers still stand, but perhaps you can join Ruth Hawksley and I when we do a session. We don't know when it's going to be yet, but if you want to get involved, then I'd absolutely love to have you out there. And sometimes it can be easier just working with a small group of 4 people, not a great big group of 20, because then you're trying to manage a lot of people who suddenly want to make a change. And then these small streams that we've got that aren't much more wider than that, you physically haven't got space for them. They'll be raking their head and branching the eye and all sorts. But if you want to get involved, Katie, I'd be happy to take you out.
Very happy. And also, I do quite a lot of this in Cornwall, obviously not so much in Cambridge, but actually if you go into like inner city schools and inland schools, that you target the kids who are much less exposed to this, and then you get a much wider audience. So yeah, maybe like primary schools. In like Parkside School, for example, like the kids to sort of give a talk, like even just like a 20-30 minute talk, I'm sure everyone would find it super interesting because like you're very engaging speakers, so you can get a much wider audience interested, and like a new generation start.
Yeah,
I like the sound of that collaboration. I look forward to hearing your film in due course. Can I just take the mic back here? You've probably had a longer association with chalk streams than some of the rest of us, probably.
I know they did in 2018. They did a fish survey up towards Whittlesford, but their monitoring regime has been massively reduced. And this is down to these national cuts. These national cuts have affected what they can do, Peter. They are still trying to, but the monitoring regime has been cut. They used to survey places almost every couple of years, but they're not able to get out. And then the COVID period puts certain restrictions on them. But I used to have them surveying Trumpeter Meadows. They came up there 2 or 3 times when I'd done the work there and to report on it. Then they stopped. And I think they're only going out to places almost every 6 years. Well, if your fish are only living to maybe 5 or 6 years old, what's the use of that frequency? And that's upset some of the staff at the ground level. It's a decision been made by very high level to cut the amount of reporting and monitoring, but it's almost broken the whole purpose of what they're trying to monitor. So I know that they've been big cutbacks, so they won't be monitoring as frequently as they used to. But they are still out there.
The big trout, round trout, the bigger brown trout, the lovely big.
Yeah, the males, the big older males.
Gone.
Yep. I do agree with you, Peter. Yeah. I know for a fact that I used to see lots of old, mature chub around Hawkston, and I don't see them in the numbers there. There are some, but they're not there in the numbers anymore. And that is a bit odd, because there used to be such an abundant fish, and there used to be black shoals of minnows in the gravels, and you don't see the thousands of minnows there in the summertime now. And that is worrying as well. It might do if we can get more flow. More flow is the underlying factor to many of these problems. Katie.
At home, I know you wanted to say something about the role of the CRT. Can you hear us all right? Well, we'll take note of that one. Chris.
Yes, well, I was noticing there's so much of it depends on sort of the flow of the river and a lot of hydraulics in this.
Yeah.
Is there actually any particular science in there, or is it by experience and looking at lots of water flowing?
No, there's a huge amount of science, but I'm not a hydrologist, so I won't be able to tell you. But if you Google chalk streams first, there's a mathematical equation that as you come down the river valley, the amount of groundwater increases by a certain factor, but that gives you much, much more increase in river flow, because you've got all that water coming down the hill, and if that water's not sinking into the ground, it's actually being supported by more water coming in from the valley sides. Your volume of flow increases many folds as it comes down the river. If we could let our river catchments function more naturally, we wouldn't have the water crisis that we're getting now here in the Cambridge area.
I mean, when you look at a straight bit of river or a river bend, you just feel, I want to do that.
Yeah.
I've seen it before and you do it again.
Straightening the rivers is just back to front now, because it doesn't make them flow better. They silt up and they try and meander anyway. And you end up with more river maintenance.
A point you were making earlier is that the origins of these chalk streams, the Romans and so on, creating the sites, the mills. I think if I'm right, the Environment Agency has identified 36,000 former mill sites around.
Quite likely.
And of course, they were effectively renewable energy. Just a few of them are again with screw systems and so on. Does that
give me great concern?
Impact on the river, or does
it's a massive impact. Hydropower.
Yes.
Isn't as green as people would believe. Right. The Archimedes screw is a massive threat to eels, slices them up.
Even with a fish pass.
Why would a fish try and swim up the fish pass when the main flow is coming down the turbine? Right. Fish want to often swim up the biggest channel, because if they're going up the fish pass, that might just be a smaller flow. So the first thing is, why can't we have the turbines on side streams where they might not be on the main channel and let the river flow freely? There may be an absolute need in some situations for green energy, especially when we've got the challenges of world politics at the moment. Yes. But many hydro schemes have been rushed in. The fish pass is in the wrong place. The fish pass is the wrong type, because not many fish want to jump anyway. Not many fish want to swim through rapid channels. Yes. And fish will follow upstream until they can't anymore. And they will throw themselves at features until they're picked off by predators or maybe whacked on the head and drift downstream exhausted.
Right, we need to wrap this up quite soon. I want to just take the opportunity to ask you about probably the site that many of us know as well as any other, which is the bottom end of the recreation ground at Great Shelford, which is, of course, I guess, the Mill Leap rather than...
Yeah, King's Mill bit there.
And, of course, one of the few places where the mill, although not operational, is still largely structurally present. And yet the river, or Mill Leap as I call it, upstream of that, has been very clear. It's quite deep, flows quite well. And I know you had some input to the management of the bank.
Yes. Yeah.
How do you feel about that project? How should we take projects like that to help people appreciate these streams?
The project there, we were trying to restore or make good, because it's not truly restoring it, because it's in the mill pond backed up by the King's Mill there. And there's overflow channels, spillways onto the lower land into the floodplain. So we're already working with effectively impounded reach, which meant I couldn't put in gravel shoals, you couldn't put in riffles, because you're working in a ponded situation. And the playing fields there were more important for river access and enjoyment. So what we tried to establish there was an access shoal where the dogs could get in, and we had marginal vegetation being planted. But I think, I've not seen it for a couple of years now, but when I last looked at it, it wasn't in a perfect way, because it's been hammered by dogs jumping all over it and kids throwing those stones back in the river. So the gravel bar we had there that enabled them to get in, they've picked up and they've launched it into the river. So that comes down to managing the people, managing the dogs, and actually probably being bigger and bolder in terms of shaggy structures to stop the dogs running through the plants. Yeah, it looked beautiful when it was first done, but it is starting to look a bit warm.
Not probably your original ideas maybe haven't been fulfilled there.
No.
Right. Well, I've found that a fascinating evening. I think it's now about 9:45, so probably about time we wound up. Any further questions or comments before we do wind up? Anything on the chat?
Just lots of thank yous for a fascinating.
I'll take that, thank you.
And I think thank yous from the room as well, Rob, and perhaps we'll show that in the.
Can I just be
Chris, yes.
As treasurer for 2G3S, I say we've already made quite a donation to the Brown Trout Trust, which has been gratefully received. And there is a collection pot on the table, which, if you're feeling very generous, would recoup some of our expenses. I don't think we can run to another cup of tea. I probably could.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
That's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, I think the kettle's not quite, the water in the kettle's not quite as warm as it was. You're very welcome to a cold cup of tea if you feel like staying on with us. Rob, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciated, and lots of ideas for the future. It's exactly what we try to do, a conversation evening, and I'm really grateful for you for sort of taking part in that conversation as well as giving a very informative and fascinating talk. So thank you from all of us.
Thank you.
Right.